Well, hello and welcome to the Lyle Shelton Show. It's great to have your company. I want to look at two really important elections that are coming up in this week's show. Well, they're not coming up in this week's show, but they're coming up in the next 6 weeks or so. The first is the Queensland election on October 31, where Anastasia Palaszczuk's Labor government will be seeking a third term in office. The second election will be that on November 3, and that, of course, is the US presidential election where Donald Trump is seeking a second term. He's term limited. He can only have 2 terms, and he's up against the Democrat contender, Joe Biden. And I've got a very special guest coming up later in the show to talk about the US presidential election, and that's my friend George Christensen, who's the federal member for Dawson in North Queensland, based in Mackay. And George is an avid follower of politics and particularly US politics, and I'm sure you'll enjoy his insights a little later in the show. But wherever you're watching today, whether on the video or if you're listening indeed on a podcast, as I was listening to Good Source podcasts last week in the car, it's great to have your company, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy my first guest, and that's Dr. Mark Robinson, a good friend of mine. I've known Mark for over 10 years since he first got into the Queensland Parliament, and he's been one of the good guys in the Parliament, turned a marginal seat into a safe LNP seat, and he's recontesting this time around. But I want to get his analysis on what we can expect coming up in this election. Mark, welcome to the Lyle Shelton Show.
Hey, Lyle. Pleasure to be with you.
It's fantastic to have you, Mark. And just so people are aware, not only are you and I friends, but I've been doing some part-time work for you over the last year, which has been an absolute privilege and a delight. I've learned a lot about politics from you in that time, but I just wanted our audience to be aware of that. And thank you, Mark, for the opportunity to engage with you and with the LNP.
Oh, well, that's been a pleasure to work with you in a closer way, Lyle, and it's been a mutual thing.
Thanks, Mark. Well, Mark, we've got you here today because I want to get your insights into the election, and particularly on some of the social values, some of the things that are not talked about much in the mainstream media, but have come to the fore because others are really driving them, the left of politics. But before we do, I think it's fair to say, as we look at this election, Anastasia Palaszczuk seems to have been very much a puppet premier. I know she's a nice lady. I've seen her speak live. She's very personable. But it would seem if it's not Jackie Trad pulling the strings or the unions or Jeanette Young, it almost seems that someone else is pulling the strings apart from her. Is that a fair commentary on her premiership?
Look, there's no doubt in the last 6 years, even longer, that the Labor Party has drifted further and further to the extreme left. And there's no doubt that the Premier is captive to that. That's not where a lot of Queenslanders are at. It certainly doesn't appeal to your everyday worker, your blue-collar worker. And we've seen a lot of those people voting with their feet at elections. We saw at the federal election where in Queensland, a lot of people from more of a working background, a working class background, supported ScoMo. A lot of quiet Queenslanders that aren't vocal, that don't jump up and down and go to protests, but don't support the extreme radical social agenda of the left. We saw them desert Labor and continue to support practical everyday family policies that Scott Morrison put forward.
No, that's a really important point you make, Mark. And we saw Queensland politics feature heavily in the last federal election because of the reasons you've spoken about. Labor having abandoned its traditional worker base. We saw that with Jackie Trad, the then Deputy Premier, opposing and doing everything she could to try and stop the Adani Carmichael mine, which was then approved in record time after the voters gave federal Labor a big whack at the May 2019 poll.
Yeah, for sure. Very clearly in Queensland, Labor has lost its way. It's divided and split between what I call blue on green, the far left green end of Labor, and your blue collar worker that's your everyday kind of Queenslander that is no longer really supporting Labor. And we'll see that play out, I believe, again in this state election amongst many other things. And Of course, the state election will also, we've got the situation with trying to see the future in terms of coming out of recession, and the LNP has been putting forward, and the leader, Deb Frecklington, clear policies about how we will go forward and drag Queensland out of this recession and keep us safe at the same time. And they're going to be some of the big issues playing out at this state election. But I suspect there's the social policies issues. I think they will still play a very important part, because Queenslanders are worried about this radical Labor government. It's the most radical Labor government in Queensland's history in terms of being so far to the left, politically correct, social engineering, and those things are worrying your everyday Queenslander.
They certainly are, Mark, and I do want to really unpack those with you. I just want to come to one more aspect, I guess, of the economic policy, which is also radically left as well. Pre-COVID, we were hurtling towards a $90 billion state debt with no plan to pay that off, and that's Jackie Trader as Treasurer for most of that period. And then, of course, you've got the Labor government opposing wealth-creating mines like the Adani Carmichael mine in central Queensland, and also the New Hope Ackland mine just west of Toowoomba. So not only have you got a government that's radically socially, they're radical economically in terms of destroying jobs. What hope economically have we got of recovering from this now recession that's COVID induced, but heading that way prior to COVID? What hope have we got of digging ourselves out of this hole that's been created as a result of terrible radical economic mismanagement?
Well, certainly very high taxing Labor governments and their policies that don't actually help business in terms of red tape and green tape, excessive compliance. A lot of those burdens and costs to business now are certainly dragging us back. And what's needed in Queensland are policies that are going to help stimulate the economy. They're going to help us to drag us out of the recession. And we're going to need to look at a whole range of issues to do with compliances, to do with no new taxes. And Deb Frecklington and the LNP have made a clear commitment that we will put in the policies that bring economic growth, but that involved not imposing new taxes and higher taxation on people. So we're going to have to steer this ship very carefully through these very uncharted waters. But it's not a time for union-dominated government where the union bosses dictate to government what's going to happen in terms of employment. We're going to need to be nimble. We're going to need to be innovative. We're going to need to invest in tourism and the things that will dig us out of the recession that we're in.
Well, that's certainly promising, Mark, and we certainly know from the LNP side of politics that people are there because they know the value of a dollar, they know how wealth is created, that it doesn't come just out of the pockets of the taxpayer. But let's move along to some of these social policies. You've talked about Labor abandoning what mainstream Australians would normally hold dear. And I think probably one of the craziest policy developments we've seen in recent years, and it's been doubled down on by the Palaszczuk Labor government, that's this whole transgender agenda, teaching children at school that their gender is fluid. And we've seen this respectful relationships program, which is really just a flow on from the gender fluid safe schools program, made compulsory in Queensland schools. Deb Frecklington's made some important promises with regard to this sort of material in the curriculum. Can you just outline that to us?
Yeah, look, Lyle. Look, these are difficult areas to try to navigate through, but we have a few things happening in terms of providing what's the optimal or best education for our children. Queensland kids, when it comes to any form of assessment, are down the bottom when you compare across all of the states. They're not getting the kind of education that they need, and that's because of the way that this state Labor government has been running education. We've got a crowded curriculum to start with things like the teachers' union that want to run education, they want to be able to recruit children into unionism, and that should be part of their education rather than just learning the place of unions as you would normally in a political, in a lesson on politics. They want to come in and sell and promote unionism. We saw the SOP to particular communities with the Safe Schools program. Again, something crowding curriculums where under the guise of just anti-bullying, which I think we'd all say it's important for children to learn about, living with people harmoniously and dealing properly with people, but and not being a bully. Under the guise of anti-bullying programs, Safe Schools came in across a number of states, and we saw what that really was about. It was really a backdoor for bringing in gender fluid theory, which is not backed by scientific evidence. It was an attempt to change the way that works in our schools instead of actually a broad-based anti-bullying program, which Safe Schools wasn't. It was a very dangerous program. So the LNP in government in Queensland, we will review the curriculum with a view to getting back to the basics of education that will give our children a better start than they're getting now. And part of that is decluttering it and getting rid of things like Safe Schools, which is really respectful relationships by another name, which is obviously a misnaming of it, really. And we will be making changes in those areas.
Yeah, look, I think ordinary Queenslanders will certainly welcome that. Of course, as you said, no one wants to see a child bullied. Of course, we want to support any child that might be struggling with their gender identity. That of course goes without saying. But no one seriously believes that kids should be taught in school that they could be a boy trapped in a girl's body and vice versa. And I think, Mark, a lot of people took heart at your LNP conference last November when Deb Frecklington said, we will cut out the classes that kids don't need, such as transgender studies. Now, it doesn't get any clearer than that, and I think parents in Queensland will certainly welcome that.
Yeah, look, there's a very clear commitment to that by Deb Frecklington. She's listened very carefully, again, to quiet Queenslanders, everyday Queenslanders who don't want us to necessarily have to get up and argue about these things, but have made very clear their values and their views when it comes to the ballot box. And we saw that in the federal election, and I believe we'll see it again in the state election. And I think Queenslanders, they don't buy into the social engineering. They don't buy into experimenting with our children. They don't like when school authorities take responsibility and accountability off them, or take off them the rights to know what's best for their own children. And I think we're seeing that. We're seeing a move towards that under, again, a very left extreme Labor government here in Queensland. Fortunately, perhaps not quite as extreme as the Victorian Labor government and what we see in the ACT, but yet a government that seems to be heading down that direction. And it's uncharted waters, it's unsafe, and Queensland parents don't want to lose the right to be parents and make decisions and medical decisions that have impact on the mental health of their children. They don't want those decisions taken away from them.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. It's interesting, your observation that the Queensland government is heading in that extreme direction, like the ACT government under the Labor Chief Minister Andrew Barr and of course the notorious Labor Premier Daniel Andrews in Victoria. We've just seen just before this Parliament closed legislation into the Parliament that criminalises health professionals with up to 18-month jail terms who might suggest to a child that perhaps they shouldn't change their gender or they should watch and wait. Again, that's pretty extreme stuff. You're not far behind the ACT and the radical Daniel Andrews with this sort of crazy legislation. And Mark, I think our audience would be pleased to know that the LNP voted against that legislation on common sense and medical grounds.
Yes, Lyle, you're right. That's what happened in the Queensland Parliament recently. The attempt to force through, again, some very radical, extreme social experimentation on in the Parliament was the government brought in and tried to and did force through the gay conversion therapy section of what was otherwise a health bill that had other good elements in it, and to try and just sneak that through when the reality is that any kind of extreme counselling from the past that might have involved certain techniques that were, electrocution, shock, these sort of crazy things.
The red herrings, weren't they? Red herrings, they don't even happen anymore.
Absolutely. It wasn't about that. And what we're seeing is this extreme Labor government trying to come down into our everyday lives, trying to create a nanny state, just dictating to us, and taking away our freedoms of thought, freedoms of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of religion. We see these freedoms being encroached on by these just extreme, social engineering of our values.
Well, speaking of extreme, let's go to another achievement, so-called, of the Palaszczuk Labor government, really the trad Labor government, and that is the notorious abortion to birth laws that were passed in about October 2018. Now, again, the LNP under Deb Frecklington has announced in the lead up to this election, and we'll put that screenshot on a bit later, Dave, if that's okay. But although while it's there on the screen, I'll address it. Of course, Jackie Trad organised a one-year celebration of her extreme abortion laws at the Loft Bar here in West End, where I'm coming to you from today, and celebrating the killing of unborn babies. I mean, this is just extreme. And of course, Des Houghton, the wonderful former editor of the Courier Mail, got wind of this, and he revealed that Palaszczuk had told Trad not to have a celebration support of the first anniversary of abortion, but she went ahead and had it anyway. What do you think this tells us about how, we've used the word extreme a lot in this show today already, Mark, but there's no words for this type of behaviour.
Look, it was something akin to 1960s kind of sexual revolution stuff. It was just crazy, just crazy stuff. I think people thought it was barbaric. It was abhorrent. To celebrate an act that destroys one life and damages another and make a party of that. Abortion of itself is so impacting on, even if you look at the impact on women, the research is showing the destructive impact it has on their mental health. Women are severely affected by abortion in a number of cases. Some never recover from it. And yet this celebration of something that is a very difficult thing. When as a man, I'm not saying that we fully understand all that a woman goes through when she finds out that she's pregnant. Maybe, and that's we need to be respectful of that process.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. And of course, your wife Julie has worked for years supporting women with unsupported pregnancies. You and I have both heard Jaya Taki, I think is one of the bravest women in Australia, tell in tears her story of how she was coerced by her rugby league star boyfriend, Tim Simona, to kill her unborn baby, and how sad that made her feel, how gut-wrenching that was for her. So that leads me to, I guess, some of the key commitments that the LNP has made on this important social policy issue. One of them that Deb Frecklington has announced is that there'll be a review by an LNP government of the coercion of women by men to kill their unborn babies. That's a pretty substantial step forward in what's been a one-way traffic in the abortion debate for decades.
Yes, Lyle. I mean, we were all horrified going through Jackie Trad's most dangerous abortion laws in the Western world that she forced through the Parliament after two failed attempts where Queenslanders by the tens of thousands said these laws go way too far. And so what we're left with is legislation that does need reviewing and does need amending and changing. And the LNP has made it clear, and I want to acknowledge the leader, Deb Frecklington, that as a woman leading in this area, that she has made it clear that an LNP government will review Queensland's extreme abortion laws, radical abortion laws, and particularly in 3 areas, in terms of gestation limits, in terms of counselling arrangements, and protections against coercion, as you mentioned there, Lyle, where women regularly every day in Brisbane and in Queensland, women are being coerced, even within domestic violent arrangements.
Yeah.
In domestic violent situations, I should say, women are being coerced into an abortion, into unwanted abortions. And this is the underbelly that no one wants to talk about. The force and the pressure that women feel to abort by some men. And so this all has to be looked at. It's not right, and we need to make sure that we put some protections and safeguards back into that legislation.
Mark, I think that'll be applauded by a lot of ordinary Queenslanders, or quiet Queenslanders, as you rightly call them. And whilst our culture, sadly, might tacitly support the idea of abortion, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone in the street who supports abortion all the way to birth, as Jackie Trad rammed through the parliament. And that's why I think it's fantastic that the LNP under Deb Frecklington has said they're going to review those gestational limits, because I think anyone would agree that it's just gone way too far.
Oh, absolutely, Lyle. And as you know, for those who study science, who study embryology, you only have to look at the facts of the impact that abortion has on an unborn baby, especially as that baby, has all of its systems developed, the heartbeat at so many weeks, a circulatory system, sensation at certain numbers of weeks, at which then, as the nervous system develops, fully sensory within the womb. I think as we're seeing more and more research around what happens in the womb with the baby, with the embryology and development, we're understanding more and more about how horrific abortion really is. Especially, it's always the taking of a human life that's a separate human life, which makes it a justice issue. It's more than a health issue. For those who just parrot the rhetoric, oh, it's a health issue, it's between only a woman and her baby. It's a justice issue as well, because you're talking about another human life.
No, it's really, really important, Mark. And I think this review will be a big step forward in this debate, because it really has been a non-debate for decades in this country. Mark, our time's just about gone, and we've got George Christensen waiting on the line. But in my book, and sorry, this is a shameless plug, and viewers might notice some product placement behind me. But you get a mention in my book, and that's because you are one of a handful of parliamentarians who has sought to shine a light on some of the horrific practices and the dirty secrets of the abortion industry. On page 104 of my book, I record that you asked questions of the then Health Minister, Cameron Dick, about babies born alive and left to die. Can you just very quickly, in these final moments, just tell us what motivated you to do that?
Well, I kept hearing anecdotally that this was occurring in Queensland hospitals, that babies from failed abortions were born and left to die in a petri dish, and I could barely believe it. And I was hearing it from other states as well. And so I thought, well, I'll ask the question and see what comes back. I was horrified, and I've asked 2 health ministers over my 11 years that question. And when they have provided information, at one particular health minister came back with 200 cases in Queensland of babies born alive, and not all of them with...
That was over a 10-year period, wasn't it, Mark? That was 2005 to 2015, I think, those 200 babies. So.
Yeah, roughly that period. And not all of them are born with congenital abnormalities incompatible with life. Some of them were healthy babies. And then when I also learned some of them were born to healthy women. And when you say that to Queenslanders, they say, there's no way that's occurring in our Queensland hospitals. And I say, well, it is. The health minister told us it is. So, I think that we really have to look at that. I think that's another area we need to look at. Other states are Western Australia. Nick Goyron, great member of the parliament there, is is championing that there. I think people are looking about that there needs to be wind back in a lot of these areas because they're barbaric, they're un-Australian, and things have gone too.
Mark, the things we're talking about tonight, they are unbelievable. And just finally, as a parliamentarian, you've battled these issues and tried to shine a light in dark places where there's lies instead of truth. Does it disappoint you that very few people would even understand the issues that we're talking about tonight, and that there even seems to be little realisation of them, even amongst church people?
It is frustrating sometimes, Lyle. I mean, it's one of many, many things as a state MP that I do, and you're busy with many, many things.
Yeah, I know that from working in your office, Mark.
But when I take time to think of it, and it is really very frustrating when people don't know the facts out there, because I think the average everyday quiet Queenslander, when they hear these things, they say, that has to change. How do I do something about that? That's wrong. And I certainly say to all your viewers and listeners, join us, help us, put your shoulder to the plough, and help us bring change. Support us through the election. Support good candidates who are life-affirming candidates who are prepared to do something about it. Because, yes, at times it's not easy to raise these issues. Nobody wants to just keep flagging controversial issues in the parliament. None of us really want to talk about these things all the time. I just want to see action. I want to see us do the right thing and look after these precious little lives, little Queenslanders that deserve better than what they're getting.
Yeah, and of course their mothers. Mark, really well said. And look, our time is well and truly gone, but I just want to say thanks so much for taking the time to speak to the Lyle Shelton Show today. And I certainly wish you all the best in the upcoming election, and the LNP as well. I know that's a partisan comment, but if you look at the policies that we've unpacked of the other side, it would be unconscionable to vote any other way, in my view. So Mark Robinson, thanks so much for your time, and all the best on October 31.
My pleasure, Lyle. Thank you.
Well, welcome back to the Lyle Shelton Show. It's a real treat to have one of my great friends in life, George Christensen, the federal member for Dawson, based in Mackay, to come and join us. And George is going to help me unpack the US presidential election that's coming up on November the 3rd. I know George is an avid follower of politics. He's also got a show on YouTube and podcast. It's called Conservative One. And as a way to prime our conversation about US politics, and I know there's some clips that you'll see that aren't purely about US politics, but these are really inspirational. This is from the intro of George's Conservative One podcast. Take a look at this.
Never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never.
You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance.
Socialists don't like ordinary people choosing, for they might not choose socialism.
We cannot afford to be so politically correct anymore.
Conservative One with George Christensen.
George, welcome to the Lyle Shelton Show.
Thanks, Lyle. Thanks for having me on your show.
It's a real privilege, George, and I love watching your show just to watch that clip. The content and your guests are fantastic, but what do you think Winston Churchill, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher would make of where we've come to today, given that they were forerunners warning of the fruits of socialism?
Yeah, well, these are the great leaders of the Anglosphere, and I think that they would be shaking their heads. If you watch that Ronald Reagan speech in full, it's called A Time for Choosing, and anyone can go on YouTube and just type that in, Ronald Reagan, A Time for Choosing, and you will see that the entirety of that snippet of the speech that I just put in the intro. And it is a warning to the world, about the trajectory that socialism will lead you into. And I think that that people would be looking at, the woke corporatism, the rise of the welfare state, the dismantlement of unity by doing away with, I guess, the last vestiges of Christian social order in most Western countries, and they would be shaking their heads.
They would indeed. And look, that speech of Reagan's, of course, is a classic. And Winston Churchill, Thatcher there. We've just in the last few weeks seen Donald Trump give his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention. It was all virtual this year because of COVID. And so he had a very staged event outside the White House. I'm sure, like me, George, you watched it on YouTube. How do you think that speech will compare in the pantheon of great speeches, given the poignancy of the moment where we are at this point in world history?
Well, I think that Donald Trump is certainly not a Ronald Reagan, but he is the leader that we need right now in the free world for our times, because things have gotten crazy. That's the reality. Things have gotten very, very crazy, and you need some pushback against that. And Trump is the man to do it, and he has done it, and he will continue to do it. And I think that in his speech, it will look. I don't know that any of Trump's speeches are going to go down as the momentous sort of speeches that are recorded in the annals of history, but they're certainly gripping for people who are in the audience, and they certainly speak to the times and speak to those people. I think that the best speech I heard was the high energy speech that they ended up turning into an ad that Donald Trump did, where he spoke about how he was fighting for the American people and he was fighting against the globalists who had basically seized control of all the levers of power in the United States. And that was fairly high energy. And actually for a long while, I hadn't seen anything substantial like that from the Trump camp, from Donald Trump himself, until I saw that speech during the Republican National Convention. And since then, I've actually seen him deliver several high-energy speeches at his rallies that he's starting again. And I think that that's a good thing, despite what all the critics are saying about not having him because of coronavirus, the sort of virus that has a 997 out of 1,000 survival rate. But let's not talk about that. He needs high energy back in order to be re-elected, and that's what we're seeing right now. I think he will be re-elected because the energy is coming back into the campaign. Certainly hasn't been there with Joe Biden.
No, I certainly agree with you. Donald Trump is no Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher or Winston Churchill. But I watched his Mount Rushmore speech just a few weeks before the Republican National Convention. It was a brilliant enunciation of US history, the great patriots that had built the United States, the pioneers, those who had fought for freedom. And of course, he followed on with a lot of those themes in his White House speech during the convention. If you look at where the battle lines are drawn now and just how far to the left the Democratic Party has moved in terms of socialist policy, in terms of radical social policy, it really isn't hyperbole to say, as Donald Trump says, that this is probably the most momentous and important US presidential election in history. Now, that sounds like a big statement, but I don't think that's too far wrong. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, you certainly do. As someone who's been in politics in Australia, you always hear every election is the most important election. But in this scenario, I got to say, yes, actually, for the United States and for the free world, I think it is. There is so much riding on the outcome of this presidential race. Are we going to have America succumb to the philosophy of woke? Are we going to have America slide into the sort of stagnant waters of socialism that's captured largely Europe? Are we going to have America that's going to be defeatist, be introverted and looking at itself and, beating its own chest for all of the supposed ills that America has caused? Or are we going to have a strong America that's going to be able to push back on the rise of communist China, which really does threaten the free world and particularly our part of the world? So they're the challenges that are there, and it's make or break. We're going to have either Donald Trump, high energy, knows what he's there, who he's there to represent, what he's there for, or you can have Joe Biden that, quite frankly, probably doesn't know where he is half the time of the day. And I'm being a little bit facetious there, but there's an issue. And, it won't be Joe Biden's agenda. It'll be the agenda of the left and where he's directed. Kamala Harris is vice president. She's quite left, unashamedly, and he'll be directed by people like her and others that are now in control of the Democrats.
Well, I want to come back to Kamala Harris, but you raise a really important point about the rise of China. And this is why I think this election is right up there in terms of, being one of the most consequential that we've faced, certainly in our lifetimes. I was listening to Professor David Flint, another good source contributor where both your and my shows appear on that wonderful platform that Dave Pello has provided. But David Flint said that the choice will be between more managed decline of America's military might and their economic might under a Democratic administration, or strengthening America's military and economy under a Donald Trump administration. And certainly his first 4 years pre-COVID, he's proven that he was able to do both. And that has really turned the tide on what has been American decline. And of course, American decline means Chinese ascendancy, which means subservience and obedience by countries like Australia.
And look, people do get Donald Trump wrong sometimes. I mean, they like to think that he is a warmonger, anything but. Actually, if the past presidential election went a different way, America and probably the West could be at war with Russia by now, because Hillary Clinton was proposing no-fly zones over Syria, and Russia wasn't having that. And if that had happened, there would have been a hot war, hot conflict with Russia. Trump is only interested in protecting America. America first is his philosophy. I got to say, hot on the heels of that is protecting his allies like Australia. So that's why China is a different kettle of fish to conflicts in the Middle East. It really is. And Trump realizes that that's an existential threat to the United States as well as Australia. We have never seen since the Cold War the level of espionage, and attacks through cyber attacks and hacking and just foreign interference that we are seeing now out of communist China. And I don't think we're going to get the pushback from Joe Biden. I mean, you just got to go looking to see that there are numerous examples of Joe Biden saying that he's friendly with China. There's one clip out there where he reckons he's going to get some advice of Xi Jinping on how to become president. And not to mention, I won't go into it too far because I don't know all of the elements of it, and also because it's probably defamatory. But there are family connections, business connections inside of China. And that's got to be concerning because it raises the conflict of interest issue.
Interesting. Well, certainly the Democrats under Joe Biden are a far cry from what Trump is proposing. And as we've said, Trump is no Reagan, but that line in the sand line in the Reagan clip that we played at the start from your Conservative One podcast really does, I guess, sum up, I think, what's needed with China. I mean, Obama's line in the sand just kept drifting, whether it was in Syria with Assad or whether it was in the South China Sea as those islands became militarized. And at least Trump is certainly pushing back on all that. So at a geopolitical level, really important. But let's just look at some of the economic issues. Just in the last week or so, you've had Joe Biden looking at the California wildfires, their equivalent of bushfires, which they've got a hot summer there again. Happen all the time. And he's calling Donald Trump a climate arsonist because 4 more years of Donald Trump will cause more wildfires. Now, what Joe Biden is offering is more cutting of the use of fossil fuels to generate electricity. We've already got blackouts happening in California. This guy's just going to drive the economy into the ground with these sort of policies.
Well, I think that President Trump should be sending Joe Biden a thank you card again because his comments have probably just captured all of that coal country that swung heavily to Donald Trump. All in the Rust Belt. Joe Biden's falling into the old trap again. I mean, the one thing that this COVID pandemic has shown is that when something a little bit more existential is put in front of people, that they forget about this climate change nonsense. They forget about this concept that somehow politicians can control what the planet is doing, control the weather, can control whether it snows or whether the sun's too hot, or it's just nonsense. And I think it's put it in perspective, and I sincerely doubt that that line of thinking is going to capture many more people than what it already has captured. In fact, right now, I saw a poll, and it was out of the US, and climate change did not even rank on the list.
No, people just want to know their lights are going to work, and they've got blackouts in California as a result of the windmills there.
And they want to know they've got jobs and got a future for their kids in jobs, in manufacturing jobs. And manufacturing is a great user of energy. And there's one thing that Trump's done, and he's brought back manufacturing in a big way to the USA. He was in Michigan the other day, boasting about how many car plants he's actually got that state. And, they love him for it. They were cheering from the rafters every time he was saying how many car plants he got them.
It's almost like his confidence begets confidence, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does. And he's high energy. And I think that, this is being very much a commentator of the politics and the PR of what's going on in the US at the moment. But the high energy, if it's maintained, is going to be really juxtaposed against Sleepy Joe. And I think that's exactly what the Trump campaign wants. They want to move the campaign away from what the Democrats have tried to style it as, which is a referendum around the person of Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. Now, the person of Donald Trump, you and I, we might not have much time for the person of Donald Trump. Same with the average American. But the policies of Donald Trump are a very, very different thing. And the policies of Donald Trump and where he is going to take America is very, very that is good for the country, but it's very positive for most Americans. They like the idea of America being great again. They like the idea of getting the jobs back on shore. They like the idea of manufacturing coming back. Conservatives like the idea of a real pro-life president who's actually doing something by changing the numbers in the Supreme Court that may, at some stage, overturn the disastrous Roe v. Wade decision that has caused the death of millions, quite frankly.
50 million plus since 1973. Thanks for mentioning that, George. I wanted to come to Trump's social policy. And on last week's edition of the Lyle Shelton Show, I showed some clips of Trump speaking at the White House in his nomination acceptance speech. Some very positive and strong pro-life statements, more so than you would have even heard from Reagan, who was seen as a great pro-life president, but sadly delivered little for the pro-life movement. But you mentioned Kamala Harris earlier. I think a lot of people don't realize that Joe Biden's Democratic running mate was the Democrat Attorney General of California, who went after the pro-life citizen journalist David Daleiden, who exposed on secret recorded videotapes, Planned Parenthood selling unborn baby parts for money. Now, this is Kamala Harris went after him and prosecuted him in her role as Attorney General. Now she's running for Vice President of the US. Pretty clear choice for conservatives.
Well, it is a clear choice. I mean, for that to occur, they're vitriolic. I mean, that was a citizen journalists who, I shouldn't even use the word citizen, journalists who exposed Planned Parenthood for selling baby parts, selling body parts of unborn children and doing deals over dinner tables, over restaurant and cafe tables. And they exposed it. And as a result, she wanted to come after those journalists for goodness knows what, breach of privacy or all the rest of it. Turn the tables. If it was a conservative organisation and it was CNN out for them, they'd be patting them on the back. But she came after them. And it's symptomatic of the Democrats now, to the point where this is why on the stage at the Republican National Convention, they had that nun. Now, I can't recall her name off the top of my head, but she's not just from the Little Sisters of the Poor. That's right. That's right. I think she was, and more than that, she used to be a medical doctor herself and did a lot of work in third world countries before becoming a nun. And what you're seeing is a lot of Catholics actually realizing that while Donald Trump is certainly not a perfect Christian, that he is doing things in that area that no other US president has done, and they want to get behind him, to the point where the Democrats had to wheel out a left-wing priest in James Martin from the Society of Jesus, a Jesuit, extremely left, goes against most of the Catholic Church's teachings anyway, if you've read his stuff. And, they paraded him out to try and say, hey, we still get favourable support from Catholic leaders. I don't know if you've seen this yet, Lyle, but there was another priest straight after that by the name of James Altman, Father James Altman, that's put out a video there basically saying that if you are Catholic, you cannot vote Democrat. And it has taken off. It has taken off. I mean, I've got to say it's probably a bit too much even for me. I mean, it's quite political, but he does make the point that there is only one party that's now, completely and utterly in favour of abortion on demand, and that no faithful Catholic can cast their vote for that party. And it's powerful. His bishop's trying to boot him out because of it, but he's finding a lot of support from all quarters of the Catholic Church. So it's going to be interesting.
Well, George, sadly, I think that's true, and we have to call things as they are, as that priest Altman did. I hadn't seen that clip, but we have got to the stage now where the choice is so stark between the Democrats, and I was just talking with Dr. Mark Robinson, the member for Oodgeroo in the state parliament here in Queensland, about Jackie Tradd's abortion to birth law. Whether it's Labor in Australia or the Democrats in the US, they've just become more and more extreme, and they don't have any pro-life voices within their parties anymore.
But, this is interesting because the Republicans also in the US have been great at just paying lip service. And given I'm in the LNP, I won't say anything about the Australian context. But anyway, there's been a lot of lip service in the US from presidents about being pro-life, but nothing's ever been done about it. And I remember reading a book called The Samaritan Strategy by someone from the sort of evangelical religious right. This is many, many years ago, probably 20 years ago. And they were saying that after the Reagan Revolution that they had failed, and he was pulling out of the political engagement to do something else because, these Republicans say all they want about, religious freedom and being pro-life, but nothing's ever done. Well, now something is being done. And it's startling people. I think it's even startling some Republicans who are probably set in their ways of, hey, we just tell the religious right and the conservative Christians, what they want to hear. We don't actually follow through and do anything. Now he's doing it, and boy, oh boy, isn't it shaking things up. It's probably making people like Kamala Harris absolutely crazy because they've never seen that before.
Well, it is, and I think it explains why the left have become so rabid, why we're seeing riots in the streets, because they are seeing a Republican president and an administration, whether it's in the pro-life area. And let's be clear, as you said earlier, Trump is no Christian. I don't pretend he's a Christian at all. I think he's courting the evangelical vote in the US, and good on him. That's politics.
I'll be fair. I think he's a flawed Christian, Lyle. I think he's a flawed Christian.
Yeah, look, it's not for us to judge the hearts of people, and certainly his track record. He's had a very colourful past, but Bill Clinton was probably a greater abuser of women than Donald Trump was, and certainly JFK, who had prostitutes regularly in the White House. These are sordid men. So, I don't want to unpack everyone's past, but Trump is a flawed person, as are many other presidents. But as you say, he's doing what he said, whether it's on securing America's borders, whether it's on the economy, bringing manufacturing back, whether it's getting energy going. He's a doer, and he's thrown a rock in the pond. He's drained the swamp, as he said. He's actually done things as a politician. That's so unique in politics, George, as you would notice from your experience.
Yeah, well, he's kept faith with those that put him there, and
promises made, promises delivered.
That's it. That's the mantra, and he's running on it. Now, what's got him unstuck, of course, is this pandemic. And I got to say, a black swan event. No one would ever have predicted it's knocked the American economy, it's knocked the global economy about, and but I think that now eyes are wide open to the fact that a lot of people in the US, and actually by osmosis other people around the world, have now, I don't want to go down the tinfoil hat of pandemic and stuff like this, but I will just say the old saying of never let a crisis go to waste. And there are certainly a lot of people that have now used the pandemic as a political weapon, and they've tried to use it against Donald Trump. Well, that was going well for him. For a while there, I got to say, I thought, I don't know. I think his re-election chances have just really dipped, and I was very uncertain until a little thing happened after a guy was very, someone was killed. George Floyd. It was a very sad event. Probably shouldn't have went down like that. I think there's a lot more that's going to come out about that incident. I've seen the full video, and the full video is very different to the short sort of videos that you've seen. I got to say that people probably still did the wrong thing, but much more is going to come out of that. But it triggered all of these unacceptable riots. I mean, protests in the street is fine, but when people are having their cars smashed, when people are being dragged out of their stores and beaten, when people are being shot for trying to protect businesses, when people are having, we've seen scenes where people are marching down streets in suburbs telling people that you white folk are going to have to leave your houses because we're going to come in and take ownership of it. I mean, that stuff is beyond the pale. You see restaurateurs, diners having their tables overturned. And I got to tell you, every time something like that breaks out, you've just added another person to Trump's ledger.
I'm sure that's true, George. I mean, it's been shocking to watch all that going on in America. And you and I have both travelled in America. It's a great country, but it's a very polarised and divided country. But what I found obscene about all that is the Democrats virtually saying, well, the way to stop the rioting is, don't vote for Donald Trump, as if it's his fault that it's
fault.
Like a blackmail. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
But, I mean, firstly, their angle, as was the media's, and they're pretty much two sides of the same coin, the media and the Democrats. But, these were peaceful protests. You would have seen it. Everyone's seen it. Here's, half a city up in flames behind the reporter. And the tagline, as well as what he's saying, is fiery but mostly peaceful protests. Yeah. Meanwhile, half the city's been burnt down, ridiculous sort of stuff. So there was an allegation going out there that, oh, no, these are just peaceful protesters. They're not rioters. But people knew the truth. They were seeing it all over the internet. They were seeing it on Facebook. They were seeing it on YouTube because people were filming it. And I think that the attitude flipped around to enough is enough, to where the Democrats then said, well, we've got to make a response here because Trump's getting ahead of steam, because he's the only one talking about this violence in the streets and doing something about it.
That's
so
right.
They come out and then they said what you said, which is just a ridiculous thing that Donald Trump's causing it. Well, Donald Trump's not out there, with the hammers and with the knives and with the guns. It's the mob, the leftist mob.
That's right. Yep. George, like you, I think Donald Trump is going to be re-elected, and I think he'll be comfortably re-elected. There's a prediction. You heard it first on the Lyle Shelton show. But do you think the left will accept his re-election? I fear that they won't. I fear we'll see some more violence. And I remember being in Washington, D.C. for President Trump's inauguration, And the day after, I was with some people and we were traveling from Washington, D.C. up to Philadelphia. And I just saw the anger of the women who fronted up for that women's march the day after the inauguration. There are tens of thousands of them. They were driving down the freeways from New York down to Washington, D.C. We saw them at the train station. Just this sea of seething anger that Donald Trump was in the White House. I'm worried we might see that sort of irrational anger on steroids if he gets a second term.
Oh, we will. But that's absolute craziness. I mean, the guy hadn't even, come to office yet. He hadn't even, haven't even did anything. And here they were protesting in the streets about his very existence. It's insane stuff, but it does show that polarization in the United States. Look, I actually think that it's going to be close. I think that if it was normal time, if he's won the
flyover states, as you mentioned earlier, that's what got him over the line through the Electoral College last time. Surely that's going to go his way and in greater numbers this time.
Because of what I said earlier, if this was a normal year, if this was a normal presidential election, we'd know the result on the night, and the result would be Donald Trump has been re-elected. I have no doubt. But what did I say before? The old adage has come to play: never let a good crisis go to waste. And so there's this huge push for postal votes, and Donald Trump's against that, very, very rightly so, because it's open to abuse. You have some states and counties where postal voting has happened, and they've returned more votes than actually people are enrolled within those counties. So it's going to be open to massive fraud. And what we're going to see is no clear result on the night, because a lot of people, because of the fear of the virus, are not going to actually go and vote. They will postal vote. And so it will drag on.
Well, George, that would be disastrous for America if there's any lack of clarity over the result.
There will be.
I
have zero doubt that there will be a lack of.
I remember what it was like when George W. Bush was elected in that contested election against Al Gore, and America was seething with polarization at that time. It's going to be 10 times worse if this is a contested election.
I heard from an American friend the other day. He said, "If you think what's happening on the streets is bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. Wait until after the election." I mean, a lot of people are saying this is going to be a big problem. It's going to drag out. It probably will end up in the courts. There'll be, there'll be bags of postal votes that'll suddenly appear out of thin air. Results will be challenged. This is probably going a bit far, but even someone suggesting that it might have to go to Congress to work it out, and then that's going to be a major issue then. So, look, anything could happen. I could be completely wrong. He might, there might just be a big push behind Trump, and he might get over the line in that night, and it'll be a pretty, open and closed case of him just being re-elected in the landslide. But I just somehow don't think so. I think that what Hillary Clinton said on that sort of vidcast that she did the other day, that Joe Biden should not concede. This is going to be a long and drawn-out process. They know right now exactly what the strategy is. Draw it out as long as possible. Take it to the courts, take it to the streets, and see where the chips lay. Lyle, I don't know if you saw, but Joe Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's sort of Svengali, and a bunch of other people, some what they call rhinos over there, Republicans in name only, the sort of never Trumper Republicans, and a whole heap of the ex-aides out of the Obama administration. They did a bit of wargaming. They had this thing they called the Integrity Project, where they were wargaming potential results of the election. And Podesta was playing Joe Biden in this, role-playing game that they were doing. And he refused to concede. He refused to concede. Wow. Yeah. And, he then asked the military to get involved. There was even outcomes where they were saying that certain states should cede from the Union. So this is the crazy sort of, it is frightening.
The fact this is being seriously talked about by you know, political people like Podesta and for people who don't remember, 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton, that's right, she didn't concede on the night, which was extraordinary because they just thought Trump was illegitimate, and how much more so this time around. George, I really hope and pray that the scenarios that you're painting don't happen. I think that's truly frightening. I hadn't heard that analysis, but I knew in getting you on today, I know you're a follower of US politics, and what you've contributed is extraordinary. I'm sure people will enjoy this show, even though it's gone a bit longer than normal. But George, just before we go, and we're way over time, but I wanted to ask you a question on domestic politics, if I may. And this show is going to air a week or so after the events that I'm talking about today. But Scott Morrison's just announced with Angus Taylor new gas-fired power stations if the private sector fail to deliver, particularly in New South Wales, where baseload power is becoming critical, and as it has become in Victoria. We're seeing that wind and solar can't do the job, and the government's stepping in now, ramping up gas. What's your thoughts on that? Would it have been cheaper for us to have built coal-fired power stations?
You've set it up for a Dorothy Dixer there, Lyle. Absolutely, it would have been. Gas is still by far cheaper than most renewables, but coal is even cheaper. But I guess that there are, it's the elephant in the room. There's political pressure from certain elements and certain states not to go down the coal route anymore. If they don't want it, we certainly want it up here in North Queensland, and we're pushing for a coal-fired power station up here. But they're going to need to do something. So
what the government's delivering, and look, the positive that I see out of this is that at least the country is getting back on track to a trajectory of reliable electricity. Having gone the other way, we've seen it become more and more unreliable as more and more wind and solar has gone into the grid. And, of course, it's got more and more expensive. So at least this is going to bring some reliability back into the system. And whilst it won't be as cheap as what it used to be, it'll still be a lot cheaper than what it would be if we keep going down the wind, solar, and experimental, policies of batteries, etc.
Absolutely, it will. And so to that end, it's a great move, and we need more of it. If the private sector won't deliver, we can't leave it up to these woke corporations anymore. I think we need to get in there and actually show the leadership, and I think Scott Morrison's the man to do it. He certainly has. No, it's been good to see. Well, George, look, thank you so much for being so generous with your time on the Lyle Show. It's been a fascinating discussion, and look forward to talking to you again some other time. Cheers.
The Lyle Shelton Show is a production of The Good Source, hosted by Lyle Shelton. To watch, listen to, or read more content without the SJW PC fact filter, visit goodsource.news. Good, SAUCE.news. Become a Good Source supporter for exclusive access to live and unedited interview recordings, including the conversations before and after the show.